the roof of Broadcasting Building, New York City. The bells you hear are ringing to warn the people to evacuate the city as Martians approach.
You're awful funny, aren't you? Well, I can tell you one thing you're not going to keep on being funny about, and that's my sin. I'm through.
I do beseech you, if you bear me hard, now, whilst your purple hands do reek and smoke, fulfill your pleasure. Live 1,000 years, I shall not find myself so apt to die.
And the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor goes to John Houseman for The Paper Chase.
Mr. Hart, will you recite the facts of Hawkins versus McGee? I do have your name right. You are Mr. Hart.
Yes, my name is Hart.
You're not speaking loud enough, Mr. Hart. Will you speak up?
Yes, my name is Hart.
Mr. Hart, you're still not speaking loud enough. Will you stand? Now that you're on your feet, Mr. Hart, maybe the class will be able to understand you. You are on your feet?
Yes, I'm on my feet.
Loudly, Mr. Hart. Fill this room with your intelligence.
At the age of 71, John Houseman became a household name when he won his Oscar. Although it was his first acting role, to those who knew him, it was just one of a number of extraordinary achievements. John Houseman was born in Romania in 1902 and spent his early childhood travelling all over Europe with his parents. He received an English public school education at Clifton College, where his cosmopolitan background inevitably marked him out as something of an outsider. After school, he quickly established himself in the tough commercial world of international grain dealing. He moved to the United States, where at the age of only 26, he became head of the Oceanic Grain Corporation. In 1929, he met his first wife, Zita Johann, a rising Hollywood starlet who introduced him to a more glamorous world. And when his business collapsed in the Wall Street crash, he turned to the theatre to earn his living.
But I never really wanted to be in the grain business anyhow, and I was married to an actress, and I had a lot of friends in the theatre on both sides of the Atlantic. And the only way I could make even a miserable living was as a writer. And I translated plays, I adapted plays, I even wrote one or two plays, and I made a sort of rather dreary living for about 2 or 3 years. And then, totally by chance, like everything else in my life, I met a gentleman at a cocktail party called Virgil Thompson, who had written an opera, which became very famous, and which he asked me to produce and direct with him.
Saint Ignatius silent, motive not hidden. Saint Teresa silent, they were never beset. So one, come one, no saint to remember, no saint to remember. Saint Teresa knowing, young and told, if it were possible to kill 5,000 Chinamen by pressing a button, would it be done? Saint Teresa not interested. Repeat first act. A pleasure, April Fool's Day, a pleasure. Saint Teresa seated.
With the libretto by Gertrude Stein and music by Virgil Thompson, Four Saints in 3 Acts was the great critical success of 1934. With a black cast, it was an avant-garde visual extravaganza that also set a new fashion in serious music. Houseman couldn't have wished for a better vehicle to launch his career in the theatre. in a sense, from then on, one of the pressures you had was that you'd come in at the top.
Yes, well, that was always a very serious problem. It was a problem in every way, especially as a director. I found it a very painful and terrible problem because I was always something of a conniver and something of an operator. And so I found myself, right after Four Saints, the following spring, I found myself directing a play for the Theatre Guild, and a play by Maxwell Anderson called Valley Forge. And the star of that was Philip Merivale, and there were some other tough characters in that, and they immediately saw that this idiot boy didn't know anything, had no experience, and they resented being given me as a director, and they did all the theatrical tricks that you can do to humiliate and annoy a director.
We can make 1935 a genuine period of good feeling.
In response to the unemployment of the Depression, President Roosevelt launched a vast government-funded work program.
This new program of emergency public employment should, I think, be governed by a number of practical principles.
First, there was the WPA, the Works Projects Administration.
One of the smallest of these WPA schemes was the Federal Theatre, where unemployed theatre workers were paid $80 a month by the government to put on productions.
Sure, there were subsidies, but that wasn't paying them for no reason at all. It was all part of pulling the country back on its feet.
For us in the theatre, it was, of course, a bonanza. I mean, you give a lot of theatre people a roof over their heads and a minimum wage and fairly large allowances for production, and they're almost bound to turn out some masterpieces, which is exactly what happened.
He turns on the grass, alas.
Partly because of his tremendous success with black actors in Four Saints in 3 acts, Houseman soon found himself in charge of one of the most innovative federal theatre projects, the Negro Theatre of Harlem.
Very early on, I realized that we had 800 employees, of whom about half were genuinely theatrical workers. Others had been ushers or something, but nobody cared because the main thing was to keep them alive, feed them. So what the hell do you do with 800 people in the theater? So I broke the theater into 2 halves, which were not hermetically sealed. You could move from one to the other if you wanted to, but the one half was devoted to indigenous plays. And we were doing black plays by black authors, acted, of course, by blacks, directed by blacks, music by blacks, everything, and on black subject matters. And the people in Harlem enjoyed them. Then with the other half of the theater, because of my experience with Four Saints in 3 acts, I decided to do classics and to do them with no consideration of color whatever. And there were, on the project, a number of very good actors. Big problem was finding a director. I didn't want an Englishman or he'd start giving them Oxford accents. I didn't want a Broadway director. So I decided, it was an experiment, and asked Orson if he would like to come up and direct Shakespeare with the black actors. And he enthusiastically accepted the offer.
Why did you risk all on a 19 or 20-year-old boy to take charge of this? What gave you the feeling that Orson Welles had the qualities?
Really sort of at the heart of my whole partnership with Orson. It's the only person that I've ever worked with of whom I was never had the slightest doubt that he was a genius and that he would make miracles. And of course, if the whole thing had blown up within the first few days of his coming up there, we would have had to change the casting. But they loved him. They adored him. They were very impressed by his own wonderful speech. These were quite accomplished actors. And also by this very powerful personality. And he used to go out with them every night and have fun. And they really adored him.
Although barely 20, Orson Welles already had a formidable reputation in the theatre. The elder Houseman, although less flamboyant, seems to have been the guiding force. Once Houseman and Welles got together, the action began. Their first production was a bizarre voodoo version of Shakespeare's Macbeth. So what, did you propose Macbeth to him? How did it come about?
No, it was his idea, and having had the idea, it was pretty obvious what was going to happen, because he decided, you know, the life of Christophe is not unlike the history of Macbeth, and, you know, in Haiti. And also, we had an extraordinary number of performers, among whom was a little troupe of 9 drummers, African drummers, including a witch doctor. They had their own personal witch doctor who traveled with them and who had epileptic fits on the stage every night. And they contributed greatly to the mystery of the voodoos. And as you know, the witches never make sense in Macbeth. You always wonder who these ladies with long hair and beards are, or men. In this case, it worked absolutely divinely, because voodoo does have exactly that position in Haitian society that Shakespeare was telling us about Scotland, primitive times, and Macbeth.
How was the voodoo Macbeth received in Harlem itself by population there?
Well, there'd been a long tradition in American vaudeville of blacks speaking illiterately and making verbal boo-boos of one sort or another. And some of this was when they misquoted the classics. Well, they thought that this is what we were up to. They didn't think very much, or somebody told them this. So there was, in the beginning, a certain amount of opposition. In fact, Austin was ambushed one night on the way up there, and they said, "Don't you dare make fun of our people," and so on. Then, as rehearsals progressed, it became perfectly evident this was going to be a wonderful show, and they got very excited about it. And opening night, police came out. There were 4 brass bands from the Elks marching around Harlem with big banners saying, "See Macbeth." And everybody from downtown came up. It suddenly became very chic. And we got very good reviews, with a few exceptions. And there was one very famous reviewer, Percy Hammond, who'd come from Chicago. And it was really a disgraceful review, because it was not a review of the show, but it was, "This is the biggest boondoggle of all. Our money, tax money, is being wasted, giving a lot of illiterate blacks a chance to mutilate the classics." It was a vile review. And the next day, when we came up, as usual, on the subway, the house manager was standing outside, and he said, "I hate to tell you this, but there was very strange things going on last night in this theater." All those voodoo drummers and everything, they all stayed in the basement all night, and they were thumping away and screaming. And I don't know what they were doing, but it was a little alarming, and some of the neighbors complained. So Austin and I looked at each other. We knew exactly what they'd been doing, because on our way up, we'd bought the afternoon paper and discovered that Mr. Percy Hammond had had an emergency illness of some sort and had been whisked to the hospital, and about 3 days later, he died. And we were always deeply convinced that they had done him in.
The Black Macbeth was an enormous hit, a fantastic hit. And it gave, I think, Houseman and Wells a sense, it whetted their appetite, so to speak, which were wet enough. But these fellows, I mean, it said, "Oh, we really now have to go ahead and make our theater, because look what happened here." And it was the talk of New York. And then to come along and do the productions they subsequently did, there was no stopping these fellows. And all the productions were rooted in the social excitements of their times.
Their great success with the Negro Theatre led Houseman and Wells to create another government-funded company, which they called Project 891. Their 1937 production of Mark Blitzstein's Cradle Will Rock was so controversial that it forced Houseman and Wells to leave the Federal Theatre.
Well, you can't climb down and you can't say no. You can't stop the weather, not with all your dough. But when the wind blows, and when the wind blows, the cradle will rock.
It was part vaudeville, part Gilbert and Sullivan, part circus. But it really was inspired directly by Brecht and Kurt Weill. He'd seen their stuff and was terribly impressed with them. And actually, I think he dedicated the show to Brecht and acknowledged his debt. But it was a very lively show, and we never thought there were any political strings attached to this or involved in it. But as we rehearsed, and we rehearsed for quite a long time those days, as we rehearsed, suddenly the industrial situation became very tough.
There are women among the picketers determined to prevent anyone from returning to work at the steel plant in Michigan, when rioting brings the great American steel strike to a climax.
There were the big automobile strikes, and then the big steel strikes. And by the time we were ready to open, we had a very, very hot potato, which delighted us, but alarmed the federal government, the WPA authorities, quite a bit.
I pulled in all the guys I could reach.
I hope you ain't made a bad break. They look like a kind of refined-looking bunch.
With its provocative attack on the capitalist system, Cradle Will Rock so alarmed the authorities that they suddenly withdrew all funding and the theatre had to close. Wells and Houseman were still determined to carry on with rehearsals, and soon the production became the talk of New York.
We don't want a union in Steel Town.
At the last minute, they found another theatre and planned to put on the show without scenery, without orchestra, without actors, just Mark Blitzstein alone at the piano.
And finally, when we got our theatre, we went out and we made an announcement, said we're going to open this tonight. Curtain is changed from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m., and it's the Venice Theatre, which is 22 blocks away. But we invite you all and invite any friends you have because it's a big theatre and we'd love to see you all. So this curious procession began on foot, in taxis, in buses, in subways, and by about 8:30, the theatre was full, and it was a 2,500-seat theatre. And so we were still going to do it with just Mark doing the whole thing at the piano. Austin and I came out in front of the curtain, and I explained that we were not rebels, but we were artists fulfilling a commitment, and Austin explained how the show would have looked if they'd seen his show.
In the event, most of the actors were sitting in the audience and decided to join in this defiant performance, risking livelihood and careers. The production was acclaimed by audiences and critics alike.
See the market rising like a beautiful bird.
We played it for 10 days, and Austin and I were fired, and we created the Mercury Theatre about 6 weeks later.
The creation of the Mercury Theatre remains one of the great moments in American dramatic history. Norman Lloyd was one of the first actors to join the company.
Working for the Mercury Theatre was enormously exciting, and really, when I look back now, 50 years or so, the most exciting theatre experience that I had.
Once again, the political upheavals of the 30s influenced the way Houseman and Wells approached the classics when they decided to stage their own contemporary version of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar.
Austin had the idea that with everybody so disturbed about the fascist movements and the Nazi movements in Europe, that this play had a very particular significance for Americans in the year 1937.
The immediacy of Caesar, I really cannot convey to you. It was as if it was written the night before. You'd say, how could a fellow write a play that fast and really capture the world as it is today? And I've never seen, in my experience, a Shakespearean play have such immediacy for an audience because they saw their lives really up on the stage in Shakespeare. Orson put it in what was called modern dress. All the officers were in the fascisti uniforms. Blitzstein used the Giovinezza, which was the fascist anthem.
Norman Lloyd himself played the part of Cinna the poet.
the story of Julius Caesar itself was so close to something that might have been happening in the 30s. That is, the dictator, the liberal who thought that by being a liberal you could, you know, deal with things. Brutus, we're talking about Brutus. We have Antony and his way of dealing with things. So you had all these different forces coming together, the people on the streets who were affected, Sinner the Poet, which I played. And so in modern dress, and the way Orson staged it with a stage that was bare, except for the back of the theater, the brick wall of the theater was painted blood red, and everything on the side was painted blood red. And all they had were a few risers, which were painted blood red, and holes cut in them to put what were called the Nuremberg lights, as Hitler had at Nuremberg. Those lights that went straight up in the air that were so dramatic and effective with the banners and flags.
It was Orson's production. He was the director. We did a good deal of talking about it, but it was his show. And actually, he'd, as always, and this is the thing that people are inclined to misunderstand about Orson, he worked harder than any man I've ever known. And this script was prepared, and I took him up to the country and left him there for 2 weeks to work on the script. And this script was prepared with enormous care and very, very hard work.
So he came back very heavily prepared with notes on all the parts, on all the moves.
Yes.
He plotted the whole thing in great detail.
Very, very. He always did. And except later, and when he didn't, that's when the trouble began for him and for everybody. He needed, he was a magician, but he needed, like all good magicians, he needed very elaborate and meticulous preparation. Also, he needed a strong script. If you look back at all Orson's successes, his masterpieces, they're all based on very strong scripts.
Their working relationship is actually, was actually the very best that I ever saw in the theater. And, of course, it culminated with Citzen Kane, and that was the end of it. I don't think either man, although they fulfilled themselves in certain ways, ever reached the pinnacle, the energy, the fire, the adventurism that they had when they worked together. Their method of work, well, there was no method. It was just two great personalities clashing, bouncing off each other, screaming at each other, invective. They were both, incidentally, masters of the language of invective.
But in spite of the arguments, their underlying affection for each other is shown in this note Wells scribbled to Houseman.
The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
In 1938, the Mercury Theatre moved to the new dramatic medium of radio, where Wells was already a star.
CBS came to him and said, you can have your own show for the summer, and you do everything. You write, act, produce, everything. And Orson, this was his meat, and he said, absolutely. So, having done that, then I was his partner, and he said, well, you've got to get into the act, and you better learn how to write radio shows. And I said, I don't know anything about it. I've never done radio. I'm willing to learn. But he said, well, you better learn quickly. So I did.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News.
On the radio, the Houseman-Wells chemistry worked again. To liven up an otherwise far-fetched story of Martians invading the Earth, they boldly adopted a news bulletin style to give their drama an unprecedented reality.
Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
This pioneering technique took in thousands of listeners and caused widespread panic. Even Wells and Houseman were surprised by the impact of their broadcast.
We are deeply shocked and deeply regretful about the results of last night's broadcast. Every radio program tries to be more dramatic than life, as every play tries to be more dramatic than life in every movie.
Houseman and Wells had once again identified the paranoia of the time and exploited it.
Within the last few months, we'd had the Munich crisis, and suddenly the American public had discovered that they could get their news faster and better through radio than they could in the newspapers. So the little box suddenly assumed enormous credibility.
2X2L calling CQ, New York. Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone?
Good evening, Mr. Kane. There is a man. A certain man. And for the poor, you may be sure that he'll do all he can. Who is this one? His favorite son. That by his action has the traction magnets on the run. Who loves to...
John Houseman was to play a significant role in Orson Welles' greatest triumph, Citzen Kane, although the strains in their creative relationship had reached breaking point.
I'll bet you find you're not alive if you don't know his name.
It was a fairly equal partnership in which I never for a moment interfered with any of his direction, but he let me sort of run the shop to a great extent. Then, after our great success, 3 years later, our great success at the Mercury, when he made the cover of Time, and the famous War of the Worlds, after that, he became a very, very big public figure. So I sort of realized gradually that much as I was enjoying a lot of the work we were doing, that as far as I was concerned, the relationship was no longer the same. And then we'd always screamed and yelled at each other, but suddenly our yelling became less good-natured, and I decided that I'd had it.
Don't worry about me. I'm Charles Foster Kane. I'm no cheap, crooked politician.
So you split up for quite a while, didn't you?
Well, we had a terrible row, a famous row, which he threw 3 flaming dishwarmers at me, and I went back to New York. And about 6 weeks later, Orson arrived. I had a phone call in the middle of the night saying, would I have lunch with him? And I did. And he told me that he and Herman Mankiewicz had discussed this multifaceted story of a great man. Well, Herman had told me the story weeks before, months before, but he'd been much less specific. He had various ideas of who this great man was. Now he and Houseman had agreed that it was William Randolph Hearst, or a version of William Randolph Hearst. And I said, well, that's fine, that sounds great. And he also said, well, will you come back and work with Herman? Herman was notoriously unreliable, and he and I had gotten on very well. So would you come and work on this idea of Herman's, and it might be my next picture? So I thought it over, and then partly because out of loyalty to Orson, and partly because it was an exciting project and I liked Herman Mankiewicz, I said yes. And Herman and I went up to Victorville, and we worked for close to 3 months on a script which later became Citzen Kane.
Maybe I was what you nowadays call a stooge, huh?
Wells wanted to be surrounded by friendly faces for his first venture into Hollywood. Not only did he ask Houseman to work with him, but also the actors from the Mercury Theatre.
I'm chairman of the board. I got nothing but time.
I think it would be fun to run a newspaper.
How much of what we see now in Citzen Kane was in the script that you and Herman worked on?
Almost all of it. Now, I have to qualify that. As far as plot was concerned, as far as characters were concerned, almost all of it. There were the usual Wells directorial touches and the conception, which were entirely his. So when, this is an argument which I have gotten into and I hate it, and I've refused to talk about it anymore. And the fact is that Citzen Kane was based on a script written by Herman Mankiewicz, edited by me, collaborated with me, and the rest of it was Orson's. He made the kind of changes that any director or producer makes on a script, and it turned out the way it did.
Why do you think he found it necessary, given his great friendship with you, which he expressed in all sorts of ways, including when he was in a jam coming to you? Why do you think he felt it necessary to claim all credit, not only yours, but Herman Mankiewicz's?
Well, I tell you, it's a very complicated story, and the fact is that when you are as much of a megalomaniac as Orson is, and we all do it. All producers are always convinced that they really wrote the script. I've gone through that temptation, but in Orson's case, the megalomania was such that he really believed it. Any project that he touched and that he was part of was his. And there may have been a few fellows pitching in and collaborating there, but, that was trivial. It was his project. And that's honestly the situation. And I think it's not just Orson. I think it's true of all the dynamics of how that kind of creative person works.
When all that period was over, Houseman still had interesting things to do in his life. Orson became a beached whale. Particularly the last 20 years, nothing. But even before that, these pictures that the film societies rave about and no one will ever see or really would be interested in seeing, despite the enormous talent. It's because he had no relation to any time, Orson. He had nothing he could hook into. But in the 30s, it was a sort of Diaghilev-Nijinsky combination, in the sense that Houseman's critical faculties, his energy, his taste, his desire, his enormous desire to do only the best things, and his fearlessness were things that Orson needed and feasted on and rested on, so that he therefore functioned at his best.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
By this time, America was at war, and Houseman, well known for his radio work with the Mercury Theatre, was asked to set up the wartime radio propaganda service, Voice of America. Over the next 2 years, he broadcast hundreds of morale-boosting programs to Europe.
Americans, fighting for their country while half a world away from it.
In 1943, he returned to Hollywood to work at Paramount and RKO, where he produced films such as The Blue Dahlia, They Live by Night, and Letter from an Unknown Woman. But Houseman didn't find total creative satisfaction in Hollywood until in 1950 he took up a 5-year contract with MGM. It was about that time you started working with Judd Kinberg. How did that relationship develop?
Well, one of the sort of features of the studio system is that a producer who was expected to produce a lot of pictures also had an associate, somebody who worked very closely with him. He worked with the writers, he worked on everything. About a year after I got there, I had no associate, and I was introduced to Kinberg, and we started to talk, and I asked him to come and work with me, and we worked together for about 5 years.
The producer created the project. If there is any auteur
was the producer in those days. You got the project, you decided on the writer. Very often, and John and I didn't do this, very often you didn't bring the director in as late as possible so they didn't screw anything up. You probably had a lot of the casting in place before the director came on, and you saw it from the beginning to the middle to the end. Executive Suite was the first film about big business, and we took it on because we thought it would make a stir.
Such was Hollywood's timidity after the McCarthy witch hunt that Houseman's 1953 film questioning the politics of corporate morality was considered particularly daring.
Such a thing as success, isn't it? The sense of accomplishment.
Exactly. Now, let's assume, Shaw, that you're the man running the Treadway Corporation your way. Would you be satisfied to measure your life's work by how much you raised the dividend? Would you regard your life as a success just because you managed to get the dividend to $3 or $4 or $5 or $6 or $7? Would that be enough? Is that what you want engraved on your tombstone when you die, the dividend record of the Treadway Corporation?
Are you suggesting that earnings aren't important?
I'm suggesting no such thing, and you know it.
Houseman continued with the theme of power conflict when he decided to bring Shakespeare to Hollywood. Houseman's casting was as adventurous as his choice of subject. He resisted intense MGM pressure to use only British actors in the main roles, and one of his most unexpected discoveries was a great classical talent in Marlon Brando.
Brando was letter perfect when he arrived, but he did get a lot of help from Gielgud in the matter of how you sustain and build a speech of that length, which Marlon, not having done many classics, was not familiar with. And he was very, very helpful to him. Actually, he offered Brando to share a season which he was about to, which Gielgud was about to launch at Hammersmith in London, and he was going to give him share the leading roles with Schofield, and together they would have this season. And Brando said, well, no, but he had to go scuba diving in the Caribbean, and his father had bought a lot of cows, and he had to look after that. And he never played another classic in his life.
Do you think that was a great loss?
I think he could have been the great classical actor of his day. He had everything. He had the looks, he had the strength, he had everything.
Look, in this place ran Cassius dagger through. See what a rent the envious Casca made. Through this, the well-beloved Brutus stabbed. And as he plucked his cursed steel away, mark how the blood of Caesar followed it, as rushing out of doors to be resolved if Brutus so unkindly knocked on now. For Brutus, as you know, was Caesar's angel. Judge, O ye gods, how dearly Caesar loved him. This was the most unkindest cut of all. For when the noble Caesar saw him stab in gratitude, more strong than traitor's arms quite vanquished him, then burst his mighty heart, and in his mantle, muffling up his face, even at the base of Pompey's statue, which all the while ran blood, great Caesar fell. Oh, what a fall was there, my countrymen. Then I, and you, and all of us fell down, whilst bloody treason flourished over us.
What do you think made, as a whole, what do you think made Julius Caesar so successful? I think it's a good film. That's not what I'm talking about now. Why do you think it was so successful at the box office and surprised everybody so much?
Well, it was American Shakespeare. I think some people liked that and were encouraged and stimulated by the fact that there'd been other Shakespeare films, but never an American one. Also, it's Julius Caesar, as I said earlier, when it's done properly, is a hell of a piece and really works. And in America, particularly, the whole political sort of gangsterism there was very familiar material, and it was not above anybody's head, and so it was a popular success.
Orson Welles, whose career was at this time in the doldrums, felt betrayed that Houseman hadn't involved him in the screen version of their great Mercury Theatre success.
It too brutal. I got there early one morning, And John was there before me, and a very distraught man. What it was the famous telegram. When Caesar was announced, Orson sent the telegram, "You've taken everything else from me, must you take this too?" Orson.
By this time, Houseman was recognized as MGM's class act. But even so, it was the talk of Hollywood when he persuaded the commercially minded MGM to bring the life of Van Gogh to the screen in Lust for Life.
The really distinguished thing about that picture, and that is largely Minnelli's credit, is the way the actual pictures were combined with the landscape. Because we were in all those places. We started at Auvers, where the wheat field is. We moved to Arles and Saint-Rémy and all that, and then we moved to Belgium and Holland.
The film opened to enthusiastic critical acclaim, winning an Academy Award and 4 nominations.
If not, you shall see pictures of them, for these colors give me an extraordinary exaltation. The whole earth is glowing under the southern sun.
He said, "We're in the showcase. We're the token culture people."
You played it like Humpty Dumpty and waving your arms like windmills. It was very peculiar goings-on. You've never done it before that way.
At the height of his success at MGM, Houseman made a characteristically unexpected move back to the theatre.
Paramount doesn't pay him for nothing.
In 1966, he was asked to set up a drama department at the prestigious Juilliard Music School in New York.
I knew that the whole theater in America was about to change, that the commercial theater was dead, and that the regional theaters, or the repertory theaters, whatever you like to call them, were about to come in for enormous importance in the American theater. And I knew that those theaters needed desperately to have a really high-class, skilled school to supply them with people.
A lily-livered, action-taking, horse and glass-gazing super service.
It was a wonderful thing for me because I wanted change, I wanted to do something new, and here was something I'd never been near before, which was the running of an acting school.
You did an entrance in the finest tradition of ancient English and American actresses.
It worked then.
You sort of backed in.
Yeah, I've been backing in.
I know, but do you want me to show you how you did it? No. Not tonight. Not tonight, I'm tired. No. You just come in and turn, but you really there is a famous story of an English actress who used to do that, and she did it for a very good reason. Do you know what she was doing?
Starting applause?
Yes, as she came in, backing in and starting applause. It's something you'll do one day.
What do you think you achieved? You stayed there about 7 years.
Oh, boy. We achieved a lot, and the achievements are still there. First, we set up the first, there are now others, of the great American theater schools, the acting schools. Secondly, we turned out a number of students, a number of people who proved themselves and became great stars. I mean, Patti LuPone, Kevin Kline, David Stiers, and also Robin Williams.
And a few years after that, you, again accidentally, began an entirely different career as an actor.
Pure accident. That was the biggest accident of them all. There was a young man from Arkansas who had come to Hollywood and had had a play performed, one of his first play. And I thought it was rather talented. I'd liked it, and I'd liked him. And he said, could he come and learn the theater business with my company at UCLA? So he came as third assistant stage manager, so gopher, and within a year he was now chief stage manager. But I knew that he really was a writer.
Every time that anything has ever happened in my life, John has had something to do with it. He got me to be a writer. He was always encouraging me to become a director. And finally, when I did write my first film called The Baby Maker, it was John Houseman that Robert Wise called and said, "Is Bridges ready to direct?" And Houseman said, "Absolutely." Then my second film came along called The Paper Chase. It was about a Professor Kingsfield at Harvard Law School and a young man who was terrorized by this professor. And I kept saying, how am I going to find this Kingsfield? You know, we just can't find it. And I was at his 70th birthday party out at New City. And we were all standing around the table, and I suddenly, oh my God, there is Kingsfield. I mean, it is my Kingsfield in my life, and he's perfect.
So he asked me, and I said, yeah, but I said, that's a stupid idea. You know, the studio wouldn't listen to that for a minute, so forget it and get yourself a proper Kingsfield. And by that time, he was a little obsessed with, he wanted me to play Kingsfield.
The minute that I decided to cast John as Kingsfield, well, there was this, suddenly all this rush of all these images, because I started working with him at 24 and used to be trembling in the theater. I was terrified of this man, and it was very similar to the character. I mean, I felt very much like Hart, and of course Houseman is so much like Kingsfield. He is someone who inspires you, who terrorizes you, who makes you do your very best work.
So we made the test, and it turned out to be very good. In fact, they used some of it in the picture, and the studio was enthusiastic about it. And about a week after that, I found myself in Toronto playing Professor Kingsfield.
In my classroom, there is always another question to follow your answer. Yes, you're on a treadmill. My little questions spin the tumblers of your mind. You're on an operating table. My little questions are the fingers probing your brain. We do brain surgery here. You teach yourselves the law, but I train your mind. You come in here with a skull full of mush, and you leave thinking like a lawyer.
Houseman's dramatic success in The Paper Chase resulted in a number of cameo roles in feature films such as The Fog, 3 Days of the Condor, and Rollerball. Several TV series followed which confirmed his celebrity and led to the inevitable TV commercials.
But the keystone of Smith Barney's business, stuff of which successful portfolios are made, will always be old-fashioned brains. Smith Barney. They make money the old-fashioned way. They earn it. They earn it. They earn it.
You walk down the street, and suddenly people do this, as they do, and I have to recast each time. I said, oh, I see, I'm walking with John Houseman, the star. I'm not walking with John Houseman, the producer. And I do believe that it's gotten out of hand completely, that there was a poll taken, and he was voted the man that the people trust second only to Walter Cronkite. I mean, so it's really gotten out of hand.
We need the opportunity to tell you we are grateful for the honor of being your students and learning from you.
In America, John Houseman and Professor Kingsfield, the character he inspired, are now inseparable. It's ironic that the man who spent so much of his life helping others into the limelight should end up celebrating his own 80th birthday on national television.
Happy birthday.
Mr. Hart, you have introduced a fire hazard into my classroom.
Houseman always operated on the theory that you have to get on to the next thing before they catch you doing the last thing. Don't let them catch up with you so that you're moving all the time. Now, you know, he's always said that in humorous fashion, but I think underneath it there was a great truth.
I don't know that there are many film producers, major film producers, who can also direct theater. I don't know whether there are many theatrical producers or heads of a Juilliard school that can produce films.
Do you see now any pattern to it? In your books, you say you deny a pattern. You give a lot of credence to caprice, to instinct, to boredom, to...
I have had so many accidents, so many strokes of luck, so many totally unpredictable things happen, that long ago I stopped making long-term plans of any kind because I knew they would never fructify and I'd suddenly find myself doing something else. So I accepted the caprices of my destiny very easily without any worry at all.